Great to see everyone this afternoon for our Spark session on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. We have 3 terrific Park alumni panelists and a student moderator. As a reminder, I'll just give very brief introductions of our panelists, and you can read their full bios in our virtual program. But our panelists today are from the class of 2011, Brendan Corbett. Brendan is a senior process and delivery solutions manager at Nike, where he program manages holiday execution for the North America supply chain. From the class of 2009, we have Dr. Spencer J. Johnson, who is a technical staff member for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Lincoln Laboratory, where he has worked toward the development of advanced technologies for national security since 2014. And from the class of 2008, we have Kylie King, PhD, who is an assistant professor of analytics and entrepreneurship at Champlain College and directs the college's Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So we have a student from our class of 2024 here to moderate our conversation, and I will turn it over now to Aisha.
Thank you, Eva. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Mahmood, and I, as Eva mentioned, I'm part of the class of 2024, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. Before we get started, I would like to mention that if any of the audience members have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Zoom chat box. We hope to leave about 10 to 15 minutes of our time at the end of the session for a Q&A with the panelists. So hopefully we'll get as many of your questions answered as possible. All right, so to get us kicked off, Spencer, Kylie, and Brendan, can you tell us a bit about your experiences in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Kylie, with your experience in research, and then Spencer and Brendan with your industry perspectives. And Kylie, if you want to get us started.
Sure, I would be happy to. Hi, everyone. As you've heard, my name is Kylie King, and I am an assistant professor of business and entrepreneurship. And one of the areas of research that I'm really excited about is looking at teams and the demographic characteristics and other characteristics that lead to effective teamwork. So I've done a couple of recent projects in the areas of diversity among teams. One of them was looking at the relationship between moral foundation diversity, which relates to the ways that people use their morals to approach teamwork and problem solving and their lives in general, and the relationship between how the diversity of moral foundations among team members contributes to things like trust within the team, and coordination patterns within the team, and was really surprised to see that in teams with greater levels of moral foundation diversity, there were higher levels of both affective trust and cognitive trust, meaning that those more diverse teams both trusted their team members as people and also believed their team members to have credible information about relevant tasks. So like I mentioned, that was a little bit surprising because we might think that teams that approach things from different moral foundations might have more conflict, but perhaps it's through that awareness that they have differences of opinion that they're able to try to work together and build stronger bonds to move forward. I've also looked at how different types of diversity relate to different outcomes. So how things like demographic diversity or surface level attributes that you're able to recognize when looking at someone might relate to team performance, or might relate to cognitive diversity, which are things like deeper attributes that relate to how people think, things that you can't see by just looking at people. And from my own research and the work of others, it turns out that these things are generally unrelated to each other. That is to say, cognitive diversity and demographic diversity are usually not related. So they usually contribute to different things in teams. So cognitive diversity leading to innovative thinking and creative problem solving. Demographic diversity being more beneficial in situations where people are looking to have a role model in an organization or a team or a school, and using that role model of someone who looks like them to lead them to have greater levels of aspiration and then achievement. So I'm approaching this conversation from those research angles, and I'm really excited to be here with both Brendan and Spencer to talk about this important topic. Brendan, you want to go next?
Sure. I was going to say, all right, that's a tough act to follow. So my name is Brendan. I'm currently working at Nike Been here about 3.5 years, but I've been in Oregon for close to 7. So my journey after Park took me to a few industries. I stayed on for a master's, worked on STEM education, medical device trial management, and then now at Nike. And my perspective is really from a person who's in industry trying to influence the changes that Kylie has referenced, where there's a clear value to me in prioritizing people first, and creating diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments results in more capable and higher performing teams. And so I'm an advocate for that people first mentality. Nike has a reputation as being a high performing enterprise, but to be the best you can, we really have to place people first. So I've just been an internal industry advocate, pushing and helping drive those discussions and raise awareness, so we have level platforms and a clear focus on the values that we apply to people internally as we do to consumers. And Spencer?
I think he's frozen.
Did Spencer just froze?
I think so. Although that was a lot. That was a deep thought that you just shared. But yes, I think we lost him. I'm sure he'll be back in a second. Aisha, you want to take us to a different question while we wait for him to come back?
Yes, I can do that. All right. So I think one important question to answer is just talking about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one question I have for you all is, what impact does diversity have on group processes and outcomes? So not only on the individual level, but how does diversity promote outcomes for groups and teams as a whole?
And speaking, oh, Kylie, do you want to go ahead? I can take a first run at this. So coming from an industry perspective, there's an incredible importance that we don't always apply on soft skills and the way we engage in work. The how and the methodology of work is as important as the technique and the technical expertise. And that often gets overlooked, especially for me coming from a highly technical background. I was working in manufacturing for quite a while. It's easy to say, well, as long as you can execute the technical requirement, you're great. But the reality is that accommodating and understanding who people are at their core and their identity and how they operate and all of the intrinsic elements that create that person as an individual are equally important, or not, in many cases, more important. And so from what my experiences have clearly displayed that when we provide opportunities for people to have a voice, when they feel that their characteristics as an individual are accommodated and understood and valued, and that we create a level playing field. So regardless of someone's backgrounds, regardless of their identity, regardless of their race, sex, etc., when we create an understanding environment where we approach with care and interest and understanding and a desire to be understanding, we create an environment where people can be the best version of themselves. And when you create that structure where someone can really excel as an individual, as a human being, as a person with a unique identity, suddenly the technical part becomes cake. And that's my honest belief, is that once you create that structure, you create that confidence that they can be themselves. The technical side follows, the execution follows, and the group benefits, because now you have people who are confident in who they are. And as a result, their work outcome accelerates greatly. And so that's the experience I've had, is that the more you place emphasis on an encouraged and comforting environment, the more you see people grow in terms of their work performance as well.
Yeah, I will echo that, and again, relate it to some research that I've done, as well as picking up on some themes that Brendan laid out. So the benefits of having individuals with unique attributes and characteristics can only be realized if those unique attributes and characteristics are brought forward. And that's where the inclusion piece of DE&I is really critical, is making people feel that they are included, that they are valued, and that their perspective is meaningful. And so, as I mentioned before, cognitive diversity is a really important piece here in trying to encourage people who think differently to be able to share those thoughts. So I mentioned my research that found that there were higher levels of trust in teams with varying, with greater levels of moral foundation diversity. It's been found also that diversity of thought has led to more creative outcomes. So there are things related to both team outcomes and team processes that are enhanced when people bring forward their unique contributions and that come from their different backgrounds and lived experiences.
I think that's a really good point. An example that I can give too is in a work environment. One of the things that I often did was to look at improving processes and process improvement. That's been core to my career through the entirety of it. And there's a case where I was working with manufacturing operators, and you would have people who had been in that role for 25, 30 years. And then you had people who were there for a few months, and you had people who were there on contract. So they were not necessarily a full-time employee. And there were cases where people would come forward and say, hey, I'm just a contract employee. Why does my opinion matter? They had devalued themselves because of their employment situation. But when you create an inclusive environment and say that status, that title you have doesn't matter so much as you as a person, you can garner a wealth of information. And oftentimes people in those situations who devalue themselves simply because of title or the context of who they were, in turn had huge value to add and offer. And that accelerates the capability of the team because you're drawing on a broader set of quality insights.
And it looks like Spencer is back.
Hi, sorry about that. I lost some power momentarily. So what question are we on so we can jump back in on this?
Spencer, do you want to introduce yourself and then I can pose the question
Sure.
and address it?
Spencer Johnson, sorry about that, everybody. I've been working for MIT Lincoln Laboratory for the past 6 years. I'm a part of Scholar class of 2009. After getting my undergraduate degree, I stayed at NC State and got my master's and PhD, both in electrical engineering, before joining MIT Lincoln Laboratory officially. From a D&I perspective, I jumped in pretty early into the efforts at Lincoln Laboratory in 2014, realizing that there was a very pivotal time within the organization where we had a lot of people who've been within the industry for 30, 40 years who were exiting, and we had a lot of youth coming into the industry. And so there was a nice push for diversity and a lot of new fresh blood coming in. And so it was a nice wave of individuals coming in to really try to push some different thought process, different mentalities when it comes to national defense, as well as how we're working in a hybrid academia that MIT Lincoln Laboratory is, partially industry, partially academia. And so it was a really good time to jump in feet first. I met a lot of good individuals, went to a lot of good conferences, and really kind of got my feet wet into the diversity and inclusion world that way in terms of the industry perspective. It's been really, really beneficial. We can see so many of our employees and interns that we brought in have stayed. Retention was a big issue we had for minorities and for people who were essentially not white male. And so we've really pushed towards diversifying that base, and we've had pretty good success. And you can see it walking through the hallways of the laboratory whenever we can walk through the hallways.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And then the question that Kylie and Brendan were kind of touching on is what impact does diversity have on group processes and outcomes? So if you'd like to touch on that real quick.
Oh, I mean, immensely impactful. If you just think about, getting a group of people who are from different engineering disciplines or different, business mentalities, just having that diverse thought background of how to attack a problem. Just from an academia standpoint. So then you add diversity of thought, diversity of people, diversity of backgrounds, and you come up with the greatest, most impactful solutions possible. We really push that as a laboratory, and that's why a lot of this, we recently had our first diversity and inclusion officer appointed because they started realizing the impact of just having that number of individuals, diversity of background, diversity of schools to recruit from. Geographic places across the country. Lincoln Laboratories is based out of the Boston area, and so we're now recruiting a lot on the West Coast and the Midwest, just because that difference in thought process alone and how people are raised have really shown to really grow and meet a lot of our sponsor needs. So we've really, really seen a lot of growth and a lot of really good feedback from our industry sponsors just by doing those little things.
I just want to chime in. I love that Spencer brought up the difference in education, right? Different types of engineers. You often hear with technical teams where there's this high emphasis on we want a varied background in terms of the education. There's a huge tangible, measurable benefit that's historically well known and well described regarding a variety of technical backgrounds. And you do draw that same kind of benefit when you account for a more diverse and broadly inclusive environment. And when we look at other parameters of evaluating what inclusion means and what diversity means. So it's a great extension and a reminder that there's this heritage and history at looking at diverse technical skills. And we should be applying that same focus when we talk about the individual and who people are at their core.
Yeah, I mean, it's really clear that diversity is quite complex, and it's so much more than just racial diversity. There's internal measures of diversity, external measures of diversity. So with this, complex, huge topic, how do we create spaces for all voices, both marginalized and non-marginalized groups? And how do we create a landscape that promotes inclusivity and allyship, in all spheres of life, not only in the workplace, but also in our day-to-day interactions with others?
That's a really great question. That's a really tough question. I think as we've seen in society recently, there's been a lot of strife in trying to push forward for having that diversity across not only work, but in your own social spheres. If you really want to start trying to think about how are we going to create allyship, or how are we going to really promote this sense of community, is really what it is. It's getting away from the thought of there's others or there's them, and it's really just a we. So how are we going to create this sense of community? And when you start thinking in those terms, it's more, sometimes you have to be a little bit more uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to go to a sphere that a bunch of people who don't think like you, don't look like you, who don't approach a problem the same way you do, who don't come from the same background. And so a lot of us become very insular in where we are, both in our work sphere as well as our personal sphere. Sometimes you have to try to break those bounds. And when you break those bounds is when you start to build those external relationships and start to be a little more impactful and be a little more diverse in your group thought as well as your experiences.
I think the topic of inclusive diversity, or the phrase of inclusive diversity, is really important. So trying to make sure that in your diversity efforts that you are representing all voices from all around the spectrum, and making it an open space where people feel welcome and included to be invited into that conversation. And I think through these conversations, we need to approach it with a sense of curiosity and with a sense of humor, in recognizing that we all have so much to learn from each other, and no one is going to be doing this perfectly. It's difficult work. And so we need to have grace for ourselves and grace for others who we're working with. To a previous point of thinking about, and I've been sort of chewing on this after we talked, the diversity of academic background. I feel so lucky to have participated in the Park Scholarships program, which was really my introduction to engaging with people from different academic backgrounds and being forced to have difficult conversations with people who thought differently than me based on their background. And I think that a lot of undergraduate students don't get those opportunities. I think that more and more universities are trying to do that. And I believe the Park program did that really well, and gave us all a little bit of that sense of curiosity to learn from people who are different from us.
Yeah, I can't say it better than that. It's a unique opportunity that has been at the forefront of forcing that uncomfortable situation to progress forward. And that's really one of the highlights for me, is we have to understand that to make progress requires uncomfortable acts, and to create comfort requires navigating uncomfortable situations. One of the people who inspired me was a leader that I worked under in my last role. And she joined the organization. It was more than 95% male directors and above. The senior leadership of the organization was almost exclusively male. And so she came in, NC State grad as well, so kudos to her. And she came in and said, essentially after a few weeks, she just asked the question in the staff meeting. She blanketed to the team, totally uncomfortable. This is a business meeting, but she said, why is the room entirely male? Why am I the only female leader in this organization? Especially when, if you look demographically, who is the applicant pool? Who is the capable, what's the pool of talent in the country that could fulfill this role? And it's not 95% male. So why do we have a room here where we say that we're at the forefront with a purely male environment? And that cascaded. That's a horribly uncomfortable situation. And she was extremely strong to be able to create that, to bring up that uncomfortable situation. But the result was a more comfortable environment to say, hey, we need to reflect and we need to evaluate. And that spawned an entire restructuring of how recruitment work and how the entire process goes for advocating for employment, for looking for talent to join the team. And it created a huge translation in terms of talent retention as well. Because at the time, the organization Nike was hiring tons of extremely talented young female engineers who didn't want to stay. They had no female leaders to look up to. They had no appearance of career trajectory. So in that particular case, it's really tackle that uncomfortable situation. We have to be comfortable, and we have to accept that there's going to be challenges. There's going to be situations where people may not agree, that people are going to make mistakes, and it's uncomfortable to make mistakes. But we have to be able to accept that, yes, we're going to have to face the challenging situation. But then on the back of that, we also have to be accommodating of mistakes, because by doing those two things, you enable people to create an environment that's really one that they can be comfortable and confident in. And that's on both sides. It's both those who need to embrace the change, who may not have been aware of the importance, and also to ensure that we have that environment for people who are coming in. So it's kind of a two-parter, but it's, to me, Spencer nailed it as well, that it's a really important to be comfortable with the discomfort that starts and to pave that path forward.
Yeah, thank you. In talking about kind of putting ourselves in those uncomfortable situations to kind of promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, I did want you all to touch on the effects of internal biases on our behaviors and the way we value our differences. I think often as individuals, we want to ensure that we're doing our part in serving as advocates for diverse communities. But this also comes with recognizing our own blind spots, because although we may be fervent believers in promoting equity, we may unknowingly make decisions from places of bias that can stifle diversity. So I guess my question to you all is, how do our internal biases influence our behavior? And do you have any suggestions on ways to kind of cope with those internal biases and kind of combat those?
I guess I can kick off with this, and I'm going to give a personal story that's not a pleasant one, but that is a kind of what originated the idea and the importance of understanding where people come from. So I grew up in a military family. I have a mixed race background. And when we moved back to the US from living overseas, went into first grade. And one of the first questions I got asked by a classmate a couple of weeks in was, "Is your mom a prostitute?" And to a 6-year-old. And I didn't know what that meant. All right, I'm 6. But there was a perception, and I learned years later that a parent of that child had approached my parents in an unpleasant manner and made accusations and had this perception that you're mixed race, you must be the product of prostitution. And that was then translated into her child. It's unfair to the child, right? Because they didn't have any preconceived notion, they didn't understand. But that bias was created in that person. That child, unfortunately, had an inherent belief that there's something bad just because of the way you look, before you open your mouth, before you have any sense of who a person actually is. So for me, at that early age, it was just strange. I didn't understand, didn't know what was going on. But over the years, you begin to reflect and understand that how we perceive people inherently greatly influences the way that we interact with them. And it's that snap ability, and humans are good at this. We have extremely good ability to make a snap decision about what something appears to be. That's why we're good at driving cars, right? Because we can actually process things very quickly. But we also apply that passive processing to people around us. And we do it very quickly, and we do it very regularly. And so it's a muscle that's uncomfortable, understanding what our biases are and how we process information. It's really a challenging situation to say, where am I making assumptions about people? Where am I not being fair to who a person is? And so for me, that question of unconscious bias, how do we combat that? Part of that is reflection. There was an interesting tool that was floating around that was like these 50 workplace biases, or these 50 workplace advantages that you might have. It's just yes, no questions. Some of them were things like, do you have a child? That's a huge advantage. That also changes your perception about other people with children. And it's kind of that ability to reflect on, what is my situation? What is my status? What are the factors that have led me to where I am today? And how do I reflect myself on other people? How do I process the person I am? And how does that become a reflection of how I view others around me? So actually, for me, it really has to be an intentional thing. We have to sit there and take the time to say, who am I at my core? What are my values? And how do I reflect those values on others? Because even though something that we believe may be fair for ourselves, it may not be for someone around us until we know and understand their situation better. So it becomes kind of that importance of fighting the urge to make a snap decision, fighting the urge to make a snap judgment, or fighting the urge to create a belief set immediately, and taking the time to be more intentional, to understand the other person and also understand ourselves, so we don't rush into that belief set.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. And I noticed a comment in the chat related to leaders asking what perspectives might we be missing. I think you need to do that internally also, and train yourself to try to not believe everything you think. So I love that quote, don't believe everything you think. Really, I was in the session the other day where I was practicing doing things with my fingers, right? And that was uncomfortable for me. And it's also uncomfortable for me to enter into a conversation or a room or a situation and try to force myself to not believe everything I think and question some of my assumptions. So it's something that you have to practice, and you will get better at with practice. And a lot of this comes with not wanting to shame yourself or shame others or feel like there is something inherently wrong with you for having these feelings. I think in Brendan's story, he so eloquently mentioned it was not the child's fault. So these biases, if you hear that you have implicit bias and you hold implicit bias, that can make you take a step back and want to fight it and say, well, no, I don't. I'm a good person. I don't feel this way. I, value the contributions of women and people from other cultures. But if you think about it from the perspective of perhaps people have a disadvantage that you are not facing yourself, it's easier for you to think about it that way than to think that you have an advantage that others might not have. And I also like that Brendan mentioned parenthood as a possible advantage that some people have, but in certain situations it can, in my personal life, it has been a disadvantage at times. And I know Eva has done some great work in the area of working mothers and nursing mothers, but in that phase of life, it can be extremely challenging to try to think about advocating for yourself and advocating for those around you. So taking this in a different direction, and again, thinking about all of the ways that people can bring diverse experiences to the table, but really making sure that the same principles that you're applying in groups, of making sure that you're not falling victim to groupthink, you're also not falling victim to believing every thought that goes through your head.
I think Brendan and Kylie are both spot on. And, we actually had a conversation within our laboratory a couple weeks ago about implicit bias and really understanding where you come from. And the way we approached it was almost like a Myers-Briggs test. You have to understand who you are, where you are, before you can progress forward. And so we did it was something similar to what Brendan was saying with the 50 questions. We did a kind of a questionnaire. We figured out where's your implicit bias coming from? Where are you standing from? And then discussing something with the person across the room. Where are they coming from? And kind of coming to a bridge in the middle. And it's all about having to understanding and self-awareness. And once you kind of come up with that self-awareness, it helps to progress forward. And I think, Brendan and again, Kylie were spot on when they were saying it. You have to have just that understanding awareness of people around you as well. And just kind of having that drive to go get them.
One thing that Spencer mentioned that I really liked is the peer, just reflecting with a peer. And so something that I found beneficial in my career is to identify a network of, even if it's not in name, of people who I consider peer mentors. And that's something that we often don't look for. Park program has an outstanding mentorship structure, right? And we encourage Park scholars to connect with alumni, which is incredible, and it provides huge insight. But industry doesn't often push very hard for peer mentorship, where it's a more mutualistic relationship, where it's more of a level playing field. And that's one of those places where I honestly believe it's the easiest to have our internal biases called out. Those inherent belief sets get challenged is on that level playing field. And so there are opportunities to create structures for yourself if you're not confident in your self-reflection, to seek out that support and seek out that network to where you can then have someone to support you through that process of saying, where do my biases lie?
Thank you all so much. I guess one last question I can ask before we move into the Q&A with the audience is, it's easy for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to kind of be pushed to the side, especially in the workplace and in educational institutions. What are some challenges that we as a society face in terms of advancing DE&I, and how can we get around these challenges? How can we overcome these challenges?
From an industry standpoint, I think the biggest challenge is having it as actually part of your career. What we see a lot of times is that people come into their careers, they're very excited, they don't have a lot on their plates, they jump into these D&I efforts. And then 2, 3, 4 years down the road, they get pulled and sucked into more managerial roles. Their time gets less and less, or more and more demanding, less and less free, and that falls out to the wayside. And so what is something that really is, I'm hoping that the trend is going, and I've seen it in some organizations, is to make that as part of your career goals, not just to have this as a side effort, as part of a resource group, or as part of a a personal project, or something you're just really passionate about. But actually involve that within your actual job duties and responsibilities, and that's something that again, it's we're on the forefront of that in a lot of organizations, but hopefully we can get to the point where having that is not just an extracurricular, but actually something that we can do and focus on and actually tick off in a career setting situation.
And I've seen a similar emphasis from where I am. One of the things that I challenged the last leadership group I was in with was we place sustainability as a strategic objective. So in large organizations like Nike, you'll have an executive organizational strategy. And then within that, it distills its way down through tiers of the organization to different business units. And within my business unit, there were around 2,000 people before, and that's a fairly large manufacturing group. Our strategic objectives were purely around getting parts out, getting good quality product, getting on-time product. But we said the development of our team was important, but it was nowhere on that roadmap. And so my challenge to the leadership was, if this is important, if this is inherent to how we operate, if this is critical to us, if we're going to add things like sustainability, if we're going to add our human rights expectations, if we're going to add our compliance and our ethical slices of how we engage with partners, shouldn't we apply that to ourselves as well? And so when you start to ingrain diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of your objectives as an organization and mandate this is how we operate, it's subtle, it's on paper, right? It seems like it might be not that important because it's just a name. It's just putting it on a piece of paper with some other objectives. The reality is that it ends up translating into results. It creates a required focus. It's something you can't gloss over or forget. It's on the page, it's there. And then it becomes a part, to Spencer's point, of career development. So you can enroll that into saying, this is not an option. People have to consider the way they're interacting with the people around them, because when we do that, we become stronger as a whole. So I'm a huge advocate of incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion in our documentation and the way we approach our work and the way we categorize and display what we're doing.
Yeah, I was thinking of saying something very similar in that we value what we measure and we measure what we value. And so if an organization, if we as a society, if whatever we want to be talking about are saying that we measure things like diversity and we measure things like we value things like diversity and we value things like inclusion, then we better be measuring those things, diversity and inclusion. And with that measurement, I think we need to be making sure that we are explicit about what we mean by diversity. So if we say we want to increase, this is something that bugs me sometimes. People will say we want to increase the diversity of this, and I think they mean racial diversity. So I think we need to be explicit about saying what we mean by diversity. There are many different types of diversity, and we need to make sure that we are being precise, because if we want to actually make progress and make measurable progress, we need to have some precision in our measurement. We also, a challenge. So I think a big challenge that we are facing as a society is that a huge chunk of our society believes that this is not my problem, or that this is not a problem, and it's not my challenge to solve. And so that's where I think the inclusion piece, the inclusive diversity piece, is super important. So welcoming with curiosity, why do you feel this way? And what is it about your experiences that lead you to believe that this is not actually a thing? And when we talk about diversity, what do we mean by diversity? And I think everyone in their own way has unique elements of themselves that they can bring forward, and that if we can relate things and engage people in conversation rather than pushing forward with an us versus you mentality, and try to really bring people in the conversation and value their voice, I think that will move us forward. I think that'll be a challenge to get there, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is there are some people who are living and breathing and every day caring about this, and other people who are really actively pushing in the opposite direction.
I like that point. And one thing that I've learned personally is that I used to get frustrated with people who are passive about equity and inclusion and diversity. To me, it's how can you be passive, right? If we care about people, don't you want to put this at the forefront? Because the more we focus, to me, just business-wise, my thoughts on business management is the more we emphasize the growth of the individual, the more the business will benefit. Your retention, your employee performance, your motivation, your morale, your teamwork, everything improves. But people are often passive about it. And I used to get frustrated, but the realization and honest truth is oftentimes it's a matter of education and awareness and invitation. So to Kylie's point on inviting people and making it so it's not uncomfortable. For many people who are passive or dismissive, they say, well, I'm not racist, so it's okay. But the reality is that becomes the other side of the wrong coin. And that takes us into a completely different space, and that doesn't address the problem. And oftentimes, though, that's because there's just a discomfort around entering the conversation and not knowing how. So I think there's a big focus on, for me, the education and being welcoming. Whereas before I would often get frustrated, it's just an understanding that people don't all have that awareness, and it's hard to listen to it when it's a self-critique, to hear that you're not a partner, you're not an ally, you're not involved in the process. So I'm a huge fan of that slice where we say we need to invite, and we need to be proactive and to educate and support partners and people who may not have that same level of interest or emphasis.
All right, we have something in the chat from Grace Balcom. She says, love the idea that we value what we measure and we measure what we value. Can you talk a little bit more about how to go about building common narratives in our organizations surrounding diversity, and how DEI evaluation efforts can manifest themselves?
Sure, I can take a first stab at that since I provided that quote. So to the first question about how to build common narratives in our organizations surrounding diversity, I think it's by having conversations, again, about what specifically we mean about diversity, and making it clear that there are benefits to different types of diversity, and that those benefits aren't necessarily the same, but they have been proven, right? So that there are proven benefits to having people together who think differently from one another. There are proven benefits to having leaders in the organization who are not all the same in age, in gender, in race. So I think being really clear about what we mean by diversity, and then, as Brendan said, as I said, and as Spencer alluded to earlier, just making sure that we are inviting people into the conversations and letting them know that they have a valued perspective to contribute. About how DEI evaluation efforts can manifest themselves. So there are some research organizations and companies doing really cool work in the areas of measuring diversity, equity, diversity and inclusion primarily. Measurements of diversity demographic diversity is the easiest to measure because it's something that you can get by looking at someone or by asking someone to submit some information about themselves. Measuring inclusion, I think, is perhaps more challenging, but equally, if not more important in creating organizations and societies that work well together. And so I can't remember the name of the organization right now, but I know I'll try to find it and put it in the chat, but they have different metrics and assessments that can be used to measure the inclusivity in different workplaces. And I think there are cool efforts that are going on in this space. People are recognizing it's important, they're recognizing that we need to move forward, and people are starting to make an effort to do that.
You know, I think the biggest metric that we're seeing now is the advancement of a lot of minorities and people who haven't necessarily been in leadership. You can see it across a lot of different organizations. You see a lot of different boards, and it's impressive, and it's moving in the right trend. I think, and what's really impressive is that once people start to see others, I think Brendan kind of alluded to this earlier, once you kind of see other people who look like you in organizations higher up, in leadership positions, it empowers you to not only continue with that organization, but to also aspire for higher and higher positions yourself. So, you know, having that forefront of folks who are out there now kind of, you know, helping lay the path is super significant to a lot of people coming up, whether you're in kindergarten now or whether you're graduating college. It's super important to have those faces and those energies and those people you can talk to and mentor and look up to and aspire to be. And that's really one of the biggest signs I've seen as a metric of, you know, the importance and value that we're seeing placed on the diversity in a lot of industries currently.
And to go along with what Spencer was saying, one thing that I've noticed is there's a strong desire, and I think we as people like having data, and there's a variety of ways of measuring success. And measuring success doesn't necessarily mean we're monitoring a metric. Measuring success can also be measuring the outcome of the decisions we make. As one example, looking at retention, young employee retention was huge for the last business unit I was in. We had fairly high turnover. It was to people going to other jobs within Nike. But if you're the most technical group at Nike, you want to retain these super skilled engineers. But we weren't. We weren't. But as we transitioned into a model where we encouraged and improved the recruitment process, we encouraged the promotion and improved the promotions process, we changed the face of our leadership team through more equitable hiring practices and through more organized efforts to ensure that we had diverse candidate pools. That change of face drastically reduced the turnover rate. And as a result, you have a much stronger body of technical teams because you have people who, as Spencer mentioned, you now have a future outlook. So sometimes the measurement and the way we measure, you have to be creative. And it may not always be obvious what's the right thing to track, but it's part of that learning process. How do you be assured that your decisions are impacting things in a positive way? And the other thing I want to mention is that sometimes we have to be comfortable with the unknown in that same format of not knowing what to measure. And a lot of times we want to have, can we get a third party to come in at Nike? It's a super common. Can we get an audit? Companies of all scales like to ask for audits to come in and evaluate some aspect of their business from some experts. Manufacturing facility, we have a safety team, but we're going to get a safety audit to see how we're doing by a third party's view, someone who's not there every day. Nike has an LGBTQI plus third party partner that does evaluations of major corporations to rate how accepting of an environment is it for the LGBTQIA plus community. So that's great. But one of the other things to remember is that those are snapshots. And oftentimes if we recognize or see issues internally, one of the most important things you can do is to speak up and to find the right avenue to drive that change forward. Because even if there's evaluations, they're not going to catch everything. Even if we measure, data is just data, and it's what's behind the data that's generally more purposeful for me. So I love the tracking and measuring. And I think it gives us that guidance and the understanding, that confirmation that our track is correct and that we're making the right decisions. But there's also, to me, a little aspect of it that we have to be comfortable without always knowing if we're going to be able to measure something, or if we have some aspect that we just need to push for because ethically, morally, it's the right direction to go. So it's kind of, for me, it ends up being a combination of those different facets of how we push forward in diversity.
All right, with just a few more minutes left, does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask? You can drop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask our panelists.
This is Carmine. I don't have a question, but Brendan's earlier comment about the question he was asked when he was 6 years old reminded me of a story one of my graduate school advisors used to tell. Well, he told it to me anyway. He and his family moved from the West Coast to Long Island, where I went to grad school. And his daughter, Molly, came home from school one day, and she said that some of the kids at school wanted to know what she was. And he said, what do you mean? She said, well, was I Catholic? Was I Jewish? Was I Protestant? Well, her father said, you go back and you tell them, if they ask you again, that you're just a decent human being. So next day, Molly goes to school, and they asked her the question, and she came home and she told her dad that she told them what he said she should say. What was that? He said, well, that I'm just a decent human being. And their response was, there's no such thing. And it just reminded me of how much of a mirror of our biases our kids can be. So I'll stop there, but I want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. It's great to see you, Kylie.
Thank you.
All right, any other last minute questions?
I'll just note that I put in the chat some of those references that I was talking about before. And if there are no other questions, I'd love to continue the conversation with Brendan and Spencer and anyone else who is interested at any point.
All right. Well, thank you very much to our three panelists for your insights. As Dr. Prioli wrote in the chat early on, in this symposium, we're seeing some of the fruits of the PARC program our graduates are teaching us. And that's a very astute observation. So thank you very much for helping all of us, wherever we are in our journey, to continue to learn and grow. Aisha, you did a terrific job as our moderator. Thank you very much for facilitating our conversation today. Our next session and final Spark session with a presentation anyway will be the State of the Park at 4:30 Eastern Time. So I invite you all to join me then to hear a little bit about how the program is doing in 2021. And we'll follow that up with a Spark social immediately afterwards. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much.